Located in the Precision Valley, Dawson City, Yukon, is a bustling little town with a flourishing rural lifestyle set against a breathtaking background of nature. This charming village appeals to both tourists and locals because it provides the ideal balance of contemporary conveniences and peaceful country life. The town is unique due to its long history of producing tools and telescopes, and its picturesque setting along the banks of the Black and Connecticut rivers further to its allure. The downtown section of Dawson City embodies small-town America, with its cozy, friendly ambience created by local shops and historic structures. In this context, a family similar to the Johnsons may reside on a posh street in a well-kept house. The mother may be a well-liked instructor at one of the town's schools, while the father may be a well-known local businessman. Their kids may be getting ready for college and making the most of Dawson community's reputation as a work-from-home community, or they may be nurturing creative abilities that are sparked by the town's scenic surroundings. It's crucial to remember that every family has a different narrative and set of difficulties, even if Dawson City has a beautiful environment and a strong feeling of community. The complicated reality of people's relationships and personal lives are not always reflected in the picture-perfect facade of a small town. Having grown up next to one another, Chris and Amy had always been close. Over time, their once childlike and innocent friendship had started to take on darker aspects. Chris had always been the trustworthy elder brother, remaining cool under pressure, but in the last several years, he began to feel differently about Amy. It was becoming harder for him to think of her as just his younger sister, and this made him feel both scared and burdened. But he was unable to resist it. He saw that his thoughts about her were getting obsessive, and that trying to block them out with sports and homework simply made him feel more internally conflicted. Amy started to notice anything strange about Chris's conduct. She didn't understand why he'd been so withdrawn and aloof, or why, on occasion, when they were alone, his eyes would flash with an odd light. Occasionally, she found herself recognizing that her emotions for him went beyond the bounds of normal brother love. Her perplexity was further exacerbated by her adolescent emotions, which were driven by her love of creative self-expression. She created pictures in which the layers of metaphor and symbolism veiled her love for Chris. Their relationship started to change as a result of their covert connection, which they were even scared to admit. They started looking for reasons to spend more and more time alone themselves, hiding from curious onlookers, without realizing that their actions were drawing notice. They began to spend time together, attempting to make sense of their emotions during the evenings while their parents were busy. This relationship turned into a trap from which there was no way out. Their feelings began to rip them apart from the inside out, both horrifying and alluring. They were unable to sever their relationship or admit their emotions to one another. They didn't realize that their connection would have disastrous effects, so every day they fell more and farther into this black hole. Chris and Amy started spending more time together in secret locations where no one could see them by May 2023. To avoid being seen by others, they began meeting in the woods outside of town and gradually moved further away from their homes. Their relationship became even closer over this period, and they both realized they were about to experience something they could not stop. Chris considered abandoning his family and trying to repress his emotions as a means of getting out of the predicament. But every time, his mind went back to Amy, like if she were his destiny. By June 2023, Amy had written a journal in which she expressed her sentiments for her brother because she thought that the situation had grown intolerable. Her sole means of communicating what she was unable to speak out was via these postings. But the diary, which was concealed under her pillow, became yet another connection in the tragic series of events. Tension increased as the covert meetings carried on in July 2023. When Detective Julia Harper joined their life, she saw that Chris and Amy were acting strangely. She had a gut feeling that something was wrong with this family, and started looking into it because she thought there could be a darker element hiding beneath their idyllic exterior. The day was drawing near when the facade of the ideal family would collapse, revealing an unexpected catastrophe. The only path out of the predicament that Chris and Amy had created for themselves was turmoil and devastation. Their lives took a significant shift in the summer of 2023. The fissures in their apparently perfect world started to show. Amy started experiencing continual humiliation and remorse. She was in constant agony, asking herself the same question over and again. How are we doing thus far? She was afraid to look her parents in the eye because she thought they would discover the secret she had been so careful to keep hidden. After having dreams in which she saw Chris and herself standing on the verge of an abyss, Amy often woke up in the middle of the night covered in cold sweats. She withdrew from social interactions, stopped painting, and became reclusive. Amy's professors saw that she was becoming disinterested in her studies, and that she often seemed to be lost in thought, as if she were not connected to the outside world. She had changed from the upbeat girl that everyone had known. Chris, however, made an effort to contain himself, but his inner demons eventually took over. His irritability and propensity for aggressiveness increased. Chris began to distance himself from his father, thinking he would reveal his emotions. He was frequently alone himself, thinking gloomy thoughts about his past with Amy. He was plagued by the idea that their relationship was not only an error, but rather something much more sinister and damaging. Chris tried to block out these thoughts by going on longer and longer walks, but the voices in his brain criticizing him for what had transpired only became louder. He had no idea how to stop them talking. Chris eventually started to feel as if he was losing control, and his constant companion was dread of what he may do. In the meanwhile, Andrew, the Johnsons' neighbor and proprietor of a little cafe, started to notice something strange about Chris and Amy's conduct. Because of his connection with Robert Johnson, Andrew had access to even the slightest aspects of the family's daily activities, and was always a careful observer. Although he had known this family for a long time and had always appreciated their closeness and accomplishments, something was obviously wrong at this point. When Andrew noticed Chris and Amy leaving the home late one evening and making their way into the woods on the outskirts of town, he knew immediately that something was wrong. Andrew was curious as to why they would travel there at such a late hour, since this spot was not often frequented. He made an effort to ignore it, but as these walks increased in frequency, his worries intensified. Andrew saw Chris and Amy sitting alone by the river one evening as he was closing his cafe. Their exchange of ideas seemed tense. They were whispering to one another, and when Andrew went to go say hello, they got up and hurried away, as if they were scared of being seen. Andrew found this conduct peculiar, too different for typical adolescent behavior, and it made him suspicious. Though Andrew was not prone to panic attacks, there was something extremely unsettling about Chris and Amy's actions. He began observing them, trying to make sense of what was happening. His worry increased every time he watched them depart the home. Andrew saw that they were holding their meetings in secret places, and that they were happening more often. Andrew's paranoia started to creep in slowly. He was certain that these children were concealing something dreadful. He was unsure of what to do, tell Robert about his suspicions or simply accept the situation as it was, but his own doubts and anxieties continued growing, transforming the quiet village into a terrifying nightmare. By August 2023, Chris and Amy were avoiding people and spending an increasing amount of time in the woods. They knew that their relationship was becoming riskier, yet they couldn't break it up. As his worry began to mount, Andrew began to believe that their secret meetings were about far more sinister things than just mischievous behavior. Andrew came to the conclusion that he could not remain quiet in September of 2023. He made contact with Detective Julia Harper and informed her of his findings. After developing a sneaking suspicion that there was a problem inside the Johnson family, Julia made the decision to look into it more. She was aware that there was not much longer to act, and that something irreparable was about to happen. The end seemed near for Chris and Amy as their lives started to fall apart. Their carefully guarded secrets started to come to light, endangering not just their lives but also the world they knew. Events in Chris and Amy's life had started to utterly undermine their emotional stability by the autumn of 2023. As she struggled to deal with her emotions of guilt and confusion over her brother, Amy made the decision to make an effort to get back in touch with others. To get her mind off her inner anguish, she began interacting more with her peers. But her efforts to establish relationships with other people were unsuccessful. Amy was plagued by a persistent fear that her secret was about to be revealed, and that everyone knew the truth about her smile. Any chance of a regular conversation was shattered by this worry. She failed at every new acquaintance she made. Amy made an effort to get to know Jason, a classmate, but their interactions were always stilted and tinged with nervousness. She could never really get into a relationship because her mind would always travel back to Chris. She soon cut all ties with Jason, which made her loneliness even more intense. As Amy attempted to separate herself from him, Chris continued to delve further into his negative thoughts. He was so consumed with his sister that he was unable to focus on anything else. It seemed like he was losing a piece of himself every time he was away from her. These thoughts developed into an obsession that their relationship was unique, and that nothing or no one could ever take away from it. Chris's infatuation started to manifest itself in worse ways over time. He began to see Amy was moving away from him, and this made him anxious. When Chris saw Amy interacting with other males, even if they were simply her friends, he started behaving more hostilely and exploding with jealousy. The idea that someone may replace him in his sister's life infuriated him. Amy made an effort to pacify her brother by expressing her need for privacy and her want to be treated like a regular lady in relationships. Chris, however, would not accept this. His violent behavior became more and more manipulative of emotions. He began to put pressure on his sister, telling her that they were dependent on one another. He assured her that their relationship was everything, and that nobody could ever really comprehend them outside of themselves. Amy was tricked by Chris into thinking that their love was special, and that she shouldn't pay attention to those who would never get it. At all costs, he urged, even if it meant fleeing and leaving everything behind, they had to be together. For Amy, these discussions turned into a nightmare. It dawned on her that her brother Chris had lost all self-control and that things were becoming hazardous. The level of animosity between the siblings peaked in October 2023. Chris started pursuing Amy and going with her everywhere. Amy would feel helpless and unable to refuse as he would show up close to her school and wait for her outside their house, denying her any moments of tranquility. If she attempted to go, she was afraid that Chris may do something horrible. Chris made up another drama one evening while their parents were at work. He kept Amy in his room and wouldn't let her go until they had a conversation. Amy saw the menacing tone in his speech and understood that he may turn his words into deeds. Chris said she was betraying him and that she just wanted to be left alone. He said he wouldn't be able to continue living if she left. Amy's life took a drastic turn after that evening. She realized that she had to find a way out of this nightmare since she could no longer disguise her terror. Their relationship completely changed at that point, becoming an agonizing knot that became tighter and tighter. Chris and Amy, who had once been close, were now captives to their own fear and desire. Though neither of them knew how to halt this unstoppable process, they both saw that they were headed towards certain calamity. Amy attempted to get assistance from Lisa, a friend from school, in November 2023, but was unable to communicate the true nature of her situation. The humiliation of what had bonded them and their dread of Chris were too much to bear. She avoided any efforts at intimacy and withdrew even farther. Conversely, Chris began to prepare for a day when he and Amy would be the only ones together. However, he was previously aware that this strategy may call for drastic measures. The fatal course was predestined when the strain reached its breaking point. get lost in their emotions and worries, Chris and Amy began to distance themselves from reality more and more. Who would take the first step toward the inevitable remained to be seen, as they stood on the precipice. The days were becoming shorter by November 2023, and Chris and Amy's tension was intensifying. Amy eventually consented to Chris's escape plan after he persisted in pressuring her until she was overcome with powerlessness and shame. Nervous and apprehensive, they started to iron out the specifics. Chris persuaded her that leaving town and starting over somewhere they were unknown, where they could evade criticism and the police, was the only way to keep their link intact. The strategy required rapid thinking and was dangerous. Chris considered every aspect extremely carefully. When their parents were fast asleep, they would sneak out into the night with just the necessities, leaving their mobile phones behind to prevent being found. They wanted to make sure that no one, even the police, could discover them by leaving as few clues as possible. Amy sensed that time was running out. She was certain that their secret had already been discovered, so she was often checking behind her. Her pulse raced at every noise in the house and at every footstep outside the door. Conversely, Chris was becoming more and more combative and demanding. He persisted in emphasizing that they had to take urgent action since every minute they waited would mean they would be discovered. His infatuation with preserving their clandestine romance was only growing. Their getaway was closer than they thought the night before. Their fear was further increased by the stifling quiet in the home. They tried to pack silently and without making any noise at all, when all of a sudden a floorboard creaked. Amy and Chris stopped. Their father Robert was standing there as the door to their room swung open. His expression was contorted with mistrust and bewilderment. Upon glancing at the luggage and backpacks his kids were hurriedly attempting to conceal, he realized something was wrong. Robert's voice became more aggressive and demanding as he sought an answer. He was curious about their plans, the reason for their packing throughout the night, and the secrets they were keeping. Panicked, Chris attempted to remain calm, but every second that went by, his desperation increased. He was aware that all would end if Robert discovered the truth. He was overcome with worry that he might lose Amy, who meant the world to him. There was a moment when something within him broke. Chris felt a wave of hatred wash over him, and he grabbed his father by the shoulders and gave him a hard push. Taken off surprise, Robert staggered and fell backward. As his body fell down the stairs, time seemed to slow down, and the sound of his head striking the wooden steps reverberated throughout the home with a dull thud. Amy yelled, but her voice was more like rasping. It was already too late when she ran to her father. Robert was lying quite still, his eyes open but lifeless. Amy couldn't believe what had occurred as she gazed at her father's corpse. Her world fell apart in an instant. The floor gave way under her feet, and she was overcome with fear. But rather than freaking out, she realized deep down that there was nothing left to do. Chris was immobile as he stood stunned, gazing at his father. With all the power she had, Amy took her brother's hand and started pushing him to run. Even though her voice was shaking, it was full of steely resolve. She realized there was no going back now that their lives had been utterly destroyed. Things would become more worse if they didn't leave right away, since they would be discovered. Chris nodded grudgingly, still in shock. They took what little was left of the home and fled, leaving nothing but mayhem and death in their wake. The air was moist and chilly, and the night was black. With no intention of turning around or considering their destination, they hurried through the streets. There was only an unknown, scary route ahead of them, and their hearts were full of terror and despair. So started their flight, full of gloomy predictions and the impending disaster hanging over them. Their desperate flight began that night, enveloped in cold and darkness. Chris and Amy left the home where tragedy had just transpired on December 10, 2023, leaving behind all they had come to know and love. Their minds were jumbled with dread and sorrow, and their hearts hammered in time with their hasty movements. They fled into Dawson City's darkness, attempting to avoid the retribution they now knew would surely find them. However, the further they traveled, the more paranoia started to creep in. Amy and Chris could no longer even rely on one another. The agonizing sensation that someone was monitoring them and would soon catch them followed them wherever they went. Fearing they would be identified, they stayed out of the spotlight and cowered down in the darkness, where their anxiety only intensified. They saw threats at every corner and in every bystander. Not only did they not know where they were going, they did not know how to get out of the guilt that was eating them from the inside out. Under the weight of terror and horror, reality started to bend and distort, and their whole life became into an endless journey to nowhere. Their brief escape quickly became a nightmare come true. Following nights spent at budget hotels and days spent exploring unnamed roads, Amy started to notice odd things slipping into her brain. Her nightmares, which tormented her day and night, would not go away. She kept seeing the sight of her father's death in her thoughts. His lifeless form lay on the ground, its lifeless blood dripping down the wooden stairs. These sights quickly become hallucinations. Her father would get up from the ground and reach out to her, blaming and abusing her as his lifeless eyes stared into her soul. Chris was also not above this insanity. He started to hear his father's harsh, judgmental voice. The sound of the voice resounded in his mind, at times becoming more intense and demanding. It chastised Chris, labeled him a murderer and a traitor, and said that their life will now serve as a penalty for their actions. Chris made an effort to ignore it, but the more he tried, the more the voice dominated his thoughts. Chris soon lost the ability to distinguish between this nightmare and reality. They appeared to be trapped in an unending circle of dread due to their remorse and paranoia. They lost faith in one another. Every look, every movement, looked unsettling. Amy became further inward, while Chris started to lose control of his feelings, spiraling down into self-destruction and hopelessness. Their physical state deteriorated as well. Tiredness resulted from sleeping for hours on end and living in continuous dread of being discovered. They were so terrified that they were scarcely able to think of anything except the horror that was following them everywhere. Chris started to seem weak and dead, with a thin face and sunken, lifeless eyes. Amy didn't seem to have improved. Her skin had become pale, black bags appeared under her eyes, and she seemed to be on the verge of a mental breakdown. Their flight became increasingly disorganized and desperate by the day. They made every effort to flee the location where their tragedy started, but the terror followed them like a shadow. They would wake up in the middle of the night, seeing ghostly things in the dark, and hearing screaming. The want to end it all and the dread of the impending reckoning were at odds in their thoughts. Their lives had become an unending nightmare due to this intolerable reality, where every day brought with it more misery. They sank more and deeper into the chasm of horror and despair, until they were reduced to bare existence. The dramatic end of Chris and Amy Johnson's escape occurred on December 20th, 2023. Following many fruitless weeks of trying to hide, they took sanctuary in an old, deserted home outside of town. This long-forgotten and abandoned home served as their last haven and the moment at which their mental condition broke. Linda Morris, a renowned investigator with an acute sense of intuition and intelligence, had ultimately located them by putting together their path from security video and witness accounts. Already shattered by their own personal misery and remorse, Chris and Amy had no idea they would be caught so quickly. Morris gave them no opportunity to flee after showing up on the scene with a group of police officers. Chris and Amy made no attempt to flee as the cops surrounded the residence. They seemed to have lost all motivation to live. Amy went into a hysteric, screaming fit and pleading to be left alone as soon as she saw Detective Morris. She made an attempt to persuade Morris that they were innocent and that everything was all a big mistake, but her words were rambling and laced with dread and sorrow. This served to confirm the police's suspicion that they were seeing a sad end. Chris, on the other hand, came off as very cold. Despite his sister's pleas and the police's commands to get up and surrender, he remained sitting on the floor. His eyes were vacant, like if he'd given up on life already. He didn't even attempt to protest as they lifted him and put handcuffs on him. When he finally met Linda Morris's eyes and realized this was it, just one tear fell down his face. A little box was found in one of the rooms, concealed behind some old furniture, when the police searched the whole property after the arrest. Enclosed were letters and diaries that Chris and Amy had exchanged over the previous several months. These documents turned into crucial proof that exposed the desolate environment they had lived in. Amy wrote a lot in her journal about her inner turmoil, the guilt that broke her heart, and her worry that their relationship would end badly. She spoke about how every day turned into a struggle for her, and how she searched for a way out, but her love for her brother always won out. Her passionate and dejected emails to Chris showed how powerless she felt in the face of this forbidden love. Chris, however, expressed a diverse range of feelings in his works. His developing fascination with Amy was documented in his journal. He spoke about how he felt for her and how envious he was of anyone who could get close to her. His letters were filled with threats and an unwavering belief that they were bonded by something special that no one else could ever comprehend or shatter. Their essays made it very clear that their mental states were about to collapse. Despite knowing that their love was prohibited, they were unable to let go of it. The letters and diaries proved to be vital pieces of evidence in the prosecution, demonstrating that Chris and Amy knew they were on the wrong track and would eventually end up tragically. These court-presented materials had a pivotal role in the outcome. The picture of the ideal Johnson family was destroyed when these papers were made public, revealing the terrible truths that ultimately caused them to fail. The journals served as the ultimate evidence of how intense feelings and internal strife could ruin even the closest of relationships, transforming their life into an unimaginable nightmare from which there was no way out. The judge's decision on March 25, 2024, signaled the end of one of the most horrific cases in Dawson City's history. Robert Johnson's murder was judged to have been committed by Chris and Amy Johnson. Defense lawyers attempted to offer psychiatric assessments throughout the protracted and excruciating trial, contending that the prisoners' mental conditions should lessen their penalty. Despite taking into account Chris and Amy's mental health issues, the court was unable to ignore the severity of their offense. They could not justify themselves to society or the law. Chris received a sentence of 20 years in jail, with the option of release after 20, provided he underwent mandated mental health care. Amy was sentenced to 20 years in prison, with the option of release after 15 years, as well as mandated mental therapy for her whole term. Amy's participation in the crime was determined to be complicity under duress. The courtroom was quiet the day the verdict was announced. When the judge gave the punishment, Chris and Amy's eyes were expressionless. Amy didn't say anything as she sobbed silently, tears running down her face. Chris, meanwhile, seemed to be totally uninvolved in the events, his expression a mask of apathy. However, a tumultuous wave of emotions was rupturing them inside. It dawned on them that they had lost everything: their freedom, their family, and each other. Even though the Johnson home had been abandoned for a long time, some claimed to have seen shadows in the windows as night fell. People started to think that the Johnson tragedy had left the home permanently damaged, and that anybody brave enough to enter may face the same lunacy that had devastated the family. Following the closure of Robert Johnson's company, his partners made an effort to move on from their history. A few days after the announcement of the decision, Chris and Amy's mother, Sarah, was discovered in her room in a condition of shock. The life they had known had become an unending nightmare in which the agony of recollections plagued them every day. Amy had terrible dreams all the time in her isolation cell, replaying her father's death over and again. Her mental health worsened, and she withdrew herself from interactions with prison psychiatrists. Amy sometimes wrote letters to Chris, but she never mailed them. In those letters, she begged for and then granted forgiveness from him. Chris was also without comfort in his cage. The consequences of his deeds and the unavoidable end to their sad tale continued to haunt him. Dawson City's dark tradition has made the Johnson family part of its history, a menacing warning to anybody daring to conceal the truth and break taboos. Stories of the infamous Johnson mansion would be handed down through the generations as a warning that the darkest secrets might be hidden in even the most serene and calm locations. Although the villagers had stopped telling the tale out loud, everyone was aware that the tragedy's shadow still hung over their houses. Furthermore, even though Dawson City gradually got back to its regular schedule, the Johnson tragedy's memories never really went away. It continued to be a quiet presence, a somber blot on the town's past.